The roots of the problem and of the solution lie in the extraordinary diversity of people that populate South Africa. Two white groups straddle a political divide. Largely to the right of centre are the Afrikaners, an amalgam of the country's original Dutch settlers with infusions of French and German stock. It is in their hands that the reins of power rest firmly today. Largely, but by no means exclusively, to the left of centre are the English speakers, the descendants of successive waves of English settlers that have been crashing on these shores since the early decades of the 19th century. In addition, there are no fewer than 8 major black tribes and many more minor ones, ranging from the powerful Zulu nation in the east to the smaller but equally proud Vavenda in the north. Adding yet further diversity to the country are the enterprising descendants of Indians, imported as indentured laborers during the 19th century. The peoples of South Africa speak their own languages. They express themselves in terms of their own cultures, and they worship God in their own distinctive ways. Each of these peoples would like to live life according to its own conception of right and wrong. All this complexity is the background to a simple fact that lies at the heart of the South African crisis. That fact is the conflict that exists between black aspirations on the one hand and white fears on the other. The roots of this conflict are as deep as the history of South Africa. It's a fallacy that apartheid was forged by Afrikaner nationalism or that it came into existence only in the last 40 or 50 years. In fact, it forms the cornerstone of South African life, and whites, through all the historical epochs of South Africa, bear responsibility for its creation. The original white settlers of South Africa, a party of Dutch civil servants under Jan van Riebeck, planted this hedge of bitter almonds more than 320 years ago.
The point of the hedge was very simple. It was to separate the white settlers from the blacks already living in the Cape. Van Riebeck was afraid that if the white free burghers traded with the blacks, they would become too independent of the Dutch East India Company, which at that time had a monopoly in the Cape.
The first separate school for blacks was built as early as 1663. In 1678, the Dutch East India Company forbade all interracial concubinage and prohibited interracial marriage outright in 1685. 3 centuries of social, political, and economic segregation followed. The Dutch tried to prevent interaction between colonists and blacks. The British, in their turn, sought to regulate and control that interaction. But there were periods when the talents and ambitions of blacks were allowed their natural expression. One of the brightest of these took place during the mid-1800s in the Eastern Cape, here in the valley of the Keiskamma River. It was a brief golden age, the like of which we have not seen again. In 1835, 16,000 Mfengu, with 22,000 head of cattle, formally entered the Cape Colony from Natal at the express invitation of the governor of the Cape, Benjamin de Urban. He wanted them here near Peddy, as a human buffer between the white settlers in the west and the causes to the east. They started off as laborers working on white farms, but they were encouraged to farm on their own account and were allowed to buy land outright. Within a few years, they had established themselves as farmers without parallel in the area.
20 cents one. That is 60 cents.
Money realized from the sale of cash crops was invested in sheep, wagons, and tools. Over the years, they used their accumulating capital to build roads, schools, and churches.
In 1890, there were between 1,000 and 2,000 affluent commercial black farmers here in the Eastern Cape. Now you would have difficulty finding even one.
Productivity here is lower now than it was 100 years ago, despite a 20 million rand government-funded irrigation scheme and heavy subsidies.
What went wrong was that farmers here and in other parts of South Africa were too successful. They were out-competing white farmers, and they were independent. They didn't need to go and look for work on the newly discovered diamond and gold fields, where their labor was desperately needed. So what did the white colonial governments of the day do? They passed a series of laws which forced the blacks off their land and into tribal reserves. There they were no longer able to compete with whites, and neither were they able to feed their families. So they were forced to seek labor in the mines and industry. This was just the beginning of an entire network of legislation which currently controls almost every aspect of black involvement in the economy.
Many of the skills they developed in business and farming withered away, and in time even the land began to show the effects of this program of legislation. Today, whites look at the ravages of soil erosion in black farming areas and say they're simply bad farmers. They lack motivation. They're not entrepreneurs. But the truth is that given the freedom, blacks were too successful and much too competitive.
And so ended a brief golden era for black South Africans. For a few short decades, they were allowed to experience a relatively free market, unfettered land ownership, equality before the law, and unrestricted upward mobility for the enterprising. They responded magnificently. We are resolved, wherever we go, that we will uphold the just principles of liberty. We will not molest any people nor deprive them of the smallest property, but if attacked, we shall consider ourselves fully justified in defending our persons and effects.
That is taken from the famous manifesto that is commemorated here in stone in the Voortrekker Monument. These words were written by Piet Retief, and they sum up the fundamental belief that Afrikaners had in individual freedom and limited government.
It goes way back. The original trek Boers of the 18th century drifted away from the restrictions imposed by the Dutch East India Company. The patriots who declared UDI and Swellendam and Graafrenet said this of government: "We have been long enough under the yoke of slavery and are now resolved to venture the last drop of blood."
Then, of course, the Boers were so fed up with what they believed to be the unjust government of the Cape Colony that they trekked into the interior and established numerous republics in the Free State, Transvaal and Natal, in which personal freedom was enshrined, like in the Bill of Rights of the Free State Republic. The most extreme of these was the Klein Vrystaat Republic in the Eastern Transvaal, where they were so suspicious of government that they had no formal government at all. They were a constitutional anarchy.
The Boers distrusted a powerful central government, but that's exactly what Lord Milner stood for, as long as the government concerned was British, of course.
After the collapse of the Boer resistance, Lord Milner, as High Commissioner of British South Africa and Governor of the Free State and Transvaal, himself a leading architect of the Boer War, set out to create a corner of Africa that would be, forever, England. He established himself in a grand Parktown Johannesburg mansion that is today known as the Sunnyside Park Hotel. And it was from here that he tried to turn his vision of an anglicized and authoritarian South Africa into reality. Lord Milner laid in a large store of wine in these rooms, which were his cellars, and then he went to work. He did many things against Afrikaners, like expropriating their farms, but he did one thing that soured relationships between English and Afrikaans more than any other. He banned Afrikaans in government schools. He wasn't prejudiced only against Afrikaners, but also blacks. He was vehemently against blacks having any form of equality or political power at all.
One of the strongest arguments why the white man must rule is because that is the only possible means of raising the black man not to our own level of civilization, which is doubtful whether he would ever attain, but to a much higher level than that which he at present occupies. So wrote Lord Milner. Under Milner, the idea of separate residential areas was approved and implemented, and the Union of South Africa was formed without blacks taking part in the negotiations at all. By the time the National Party came to power in 1948, a formidable array of laws already existed to protect whites from competition by blacks.
All the government did was to formalize legislation so as to consolidate economic, social, and political apartheid. Their ultimate goal was that there should be no interaction between the races, except on a very superficial level in the workplace. While they were involved in this experiment in social engineering, the nationalist government was growing at a swift and terrifying pace. Now we have one of the most centralized systems of government in the world. It all happens here in Parliament, where hundreds of decisions are taken every year which affect our lives. And in many ways, this top-heavy government is one of the major causes of the intensity of the struggle which is taking place in South Africa. It's a struggle for power. Each group is afraid that some other group will take control of the power and use it to protect their own interests while they violate the interests of others.
The more that blacks have been shunted into an economic and political backwater, the more strident have grown their demands. And the more powerful the call for equality, the more fearful the whites have become of the forces that apartheid failed to tame.
There's a very simple analogy which illustrates this conflict between black aspirations and white fears. And that is the story of a lion in a cage. When the lion was put into the cage, he was just a little cub, and there really wasn't a problem. You could scratch him behind the ear through the bars and feed him with a bottle of milk, and he was very easy to control. But now the lion has grown too big for the cage. He's pacing up and down, he's growling, and he's rattling the bars. And the people outside of the cage are saying, it's really terrible to keep a big lion like that in such a small cage. But if we let him out, he's going to eat us.
Many people think the problem is insoluble, that you can't let the lion out of the cage. That is to say that you can't free blacks and have whites safe at the same time. But we think you can, and the answer lies in a proper application and understanding of real, genuine democracy.
The one thing that all South African groups agree on, right across the political spectrum, is that we should have democracy. But there are almost as many different meanings of the word democracy as there are people who use it. The real meaning of the word can be found in its roots, which is the Greek words demos and kratos, meaning people and govern. And inherent in the concept of the word is the idea that people should be involved in the decisions which affect them. There shouldn't be a small group of people which gain control of power and dominate others, but all the ordinary people themselves should have a direct say in the government decisions that affect their lives.
We looked around the world at all the systems in every country of the world, about 170 of them, and we examined all the models that have been put forward for South Africa and various ideas in political science literature, and concluded that there is one system that stands out head and shoulders above the others as one from which we in South Africa can learn, and that is the Swiss system. Switzerland is a small country, even smaller than Transkei. It is mountainous, landlocked, no natural resources, and has a history of intergroup conflict even worse than ours. And yet today Switzerland is a little miracle. It has the highest living standards in the world. It has a long history of peace and prosperity. How has this been achieved? Switzerland has a very limited central government and is divided into 27 areas called cantons. And these cantons control most of the affairs that are politically relevant in Switzerland.
What Leon and I have tried to do in our book is to show how a very democratic system like the Swiss system can be applied in South Africa. Now, we think the most important level in South Africa is the level of the ordinary people, the man in the street, and that his fundamental rights and freedoms should be protected by a Bill of Rights, which should be entrenched in the central constitution and binding on all levels of government. The most important level of government would be the canton level. And at this level, all the major political, economic, and social welfare policy decisions would be made. Each canton would have its own taxation policy, education, transport, labor policy, and so on. But they might choose to devolve a lot of these issues to community levels. The community government would be closer to the people and in smaller areas. In Switzerland, there are 3,000 communities, and some of them have as much autonomy as the cantons do. But this would be entirely up to the canton how many functions they devolve to the community level. Typical community areas of control would be parks and recreation or preschooling. Now, the central government will be made up of two houses, a popular house and a delegates' house. The popular house would be elected on the basis of numbers, and the delegates' house would have 2 delegates from each canton. This would be the balancing house. The central government would control 5 primary areas, that is to say national defense,
national finance, the provision of major infrastructure, freeways and national railroads, and foreign affairs, and finally the registration of statistics and control of the Central Appeal Court. Each of these 5 areas would have one minister, and the cabinet would be made up of the 5 ministers. The president of the country would be the chairman of the cabinet. And we think that, like in Switzerland, it would be a good idea for that president to rotate on an annual basis.
Now the question is, how can we divide the boundaries in South Africa for these areas that we have called cantons? And fortunately, that's already been done for us. South Africa already has areas called magisterial districts. Now these are entirely non-political, non-racial, non-ideological. They are neutral administrative areas developed over decades and even centuries as the logical places at which most government functions are located. For example, magisterial courts, of course, receivers of revenue, public works departments, school boards, and about 20 government functions. So what we recommend is that these areas be given control, power, over the things already administered in them. But that's not final. We don't say that it has to be like that. We recommend a neutral inquiry, something like a judicial commission of inquiry, that takes evidence from people on whether there should be consolidation of these second-level governments because they're not viable or they're too small or whatever it might be, or whether there should be further subdivision because there might be conflict or too much difference within one. And then various plausible ideas should be put to the vote, and the people of South Africa should decide for themselves on which boundaries they want, and then there need be no debate on how many or how few second-level governments or cantons we should have.
The most important consequence of devolving power to second-tier governments is that it results in what we call a demonstration effect. What this means is that different policies can be pursued by different canton governments. Some of them, for example, might have more socialist policies, more social welfare. Others might be more laissez-faire. They might have lower taxes. And people are then able to see for themselves which policy works the best. They can vote with their feet to the area which they prefer. And the result of this is that cantons will tend to pursue the policies which are the most successful. We don't need to worry about who governs, but how to minimize the errors of government. And through this demonstration effect, that is the result, that the best government rises to the fore. It's as if you had a marketplace in politics, and political leaders, governments, become like shopkeepers who have to pursue the best policies and do the best things for their customers in order to attract customers to their shops.
Now, whilst devolving power and limiting central government might be the most important component of a solution for South Africa, there's much more that we have drawn from other countries, like a Bill of Rights. We recommend a strong, unambiguous Bill of Rights that guarantees the normal civil liberties, things like the right to trial, habeas corpus, freedom of speech, association, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and also other rights, important ones like full equality at law for all South Africans, so that any discriminatory law or policy by government would be unconstitutional. That is something that would be required for us to be able to say there's a solution. In addition, we would need to protect property rights, which blacks have been denied in the past, and whites fear will be abrogated in the future. So as security for both blacks and whites against the abuse of power, real protection of property rights. In addition, there would need to be, especially for whites, the preservation of the freedoms they have held for themselves in the past, like the right of association and disassociation, so that government will no longer prescribe to people whether they integrate or segregate. People who want to segregate will be allowed to do so voluntarily, without imposing on anyone else, at their expense, and without making any discriminatory laws. There will need to be freedom of movement guaranteed, so people can move freely throughout the country to the parts of the country they prefer. And importantly, there would need to be a climate of democratic values in South Africa. What really preserves democracies in the world is that the people understand and want real freedom and democracy. In addition, there must be a strong, independent judiciary that can protect the people of South Africa in terms of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, regardless of who governs.
There's one other important way of preventing governments from abusing their power, and that is through a system of referendums, another idea which we borrowed from the Swiss system. Now, referendums are sometimes called direct democracy, as against representative democracy. People vote directly on laws which are being passed and on issues. In the canton of Zurich, they have voting Sundays. 20 Sundays of the year, people go to the polls and vote on as many as 5 different issues, using different color ballot slips, depending on whether it's a federal, cantonal, or community issue. There are 2 kinds of referenda that you can have. An obligatory referendum, whereby any proposed change to the central constitution must be put to the vote of all of the people and all of the cantons, or an optional referendum. If you don't like a law that's being introduced or one that has been introduced, and you can get a number of signatures to a petition, you can have that law put to the vote through an optional referendum. Now, Leon and I in our book have given a great deal of detail. We've really gone into the nitty-gritty of how a system like this might work. But the detail is there to give a feeling for reality. None of that detail is important to us. Indeed, we believe that that should be decided around the negotiating table. What is important is that one group is not able to gain control of the power and use it to protect their own interests and to violate the rights of others. And that is why the main principle that we believe must be there if South Africa's problems are to be solved is that of devolution of power to numerous second-tier governments. This is the only way in which we can achieve a real democracy and genuine individual freedom for all South Africans.
But how do you change a good idea into a political solution? South Africa has had many political blueprints that got no further than the drawing board. For an idea to make a difference, it has to be accepted on a broad grassroots level. Weather vanes follow the prevailing breeze. Politicians respond equally promptly to the stirrings of their constituencies. And it's at that level that an organization called Groundswell directs its efforts.
We South Africans must now come to terms with the fact that change in this country is inevitable.
I should like to ask how you persuade the people who already control the country, who wield the power, to give up that power.
What we think will happen is that at some point they're going to have to consider their options. And what are their options right now? The status quo cannot be maintained. I mean, we've already slid away from the ideal in the apartheid system. So their options perhaps are this escalating violence, the continued economic decline, perhaps more isolation from the outside world.
Nancy, I would like to know how you're going to spread the gospel to both black and white. Because now we are afraid of the whites are afraid of the blacks.
Groundswell was established in 1987 to disseminate and popularize the ideas contained in the solution, and is operating in cities and towns across South Africa. Despite the extraordinary sales of the solution and the successes of the Groundswell organization, certain objections to the ideas contained in the book are raised routinely.
I think the biggest problem that I have with the book is that it doesn't take deeply enough into consideration the reality of the different ethnic nations in this country. As far as the book is concerned, it makes provision for different groups, but what exactly you understand by the different groups is not so sure.
Whereas the Swiss started with cantons, with a divided up country, and then formed a federation, we're trying to break up what is already a union and to establish 300 odd cantons. I'm afraid it will not work.
I think that many of these cantons would be so poor, so unviable, that they just wouldn't work at all. I'm thinking of this near myself in Dwedwe. I mean, I just couldn't see that as a self-governing unit in the cantonal system.
There is a problem of rich and poor cantons or areas.
However, it's not the boundaries of a place that makes it rich or poor, but the economic policy. If we look around the world and we look at rich countries, economic miracles, we find they're typically countries without any mineral wealth, or that might be very new or small or big. Poor countries are often the countries with the most mineral wealth. It's not mineral wealth, it's not size or age, but economic policy that makes a place rich or poor. And what our canton system permits is for cantons to be able to adopt economic policies that will make them rich, high growth, even if they start poor. An example of this is the state of Nevada in America, which is a desert. And it created places like Reno and Las Vegas and made the desert blossom. In South Africa, there could be a canton that follows that kind of policy and becomes rich, and only our system would enable it to do so.
But even if some areas remain poor and others are rich, the important thing is that people should be able to move freely to where the opportunities and the jobs and the wealth is. All countries in the world have rich and poor areas. In Canada, for example, almost the entire population lives in the area of the Great Lakes, where the industrialization is, where the big cities are. And the Canadians don't try and redistribute wealth from that area into the tundra or into the forests to the north. They accept that that is the way the economy should be, and that is what is viable. The key in our system is the freedom of movement, which we don't have under a homeland policy, of course, and which would enable people to go to where the opportunities are.
Some people say that South African blacks aren't sophisticated enough to handle such an advanced system. But we must remember that when most democracies started, the population was very unsophisticated. For example, in Switzerland, which started way back in the 1200s, when the Swiss people were less sophisticated than South Africa's rural blacks are today, they didn't even vote on ballot papers. People would go down, and they still do to this day, to the village square, where they vote by a show of hands.
Implicit in this argument that we have a large third world population that can't cope with first world type democracy is the implication that blacks can't really cope with genuine freedom. But remember that only 100 years ago, when they were allowed to compete equally with whites, they walked away with the prizes in agricultural shows. They outcompeted whites in that area. Blacks don't need paternalism. They don't need a system that's meant to cater for their inadequacies. They need the right to compete freely and equally with everybody else in our country.
Even so, there is the problem that blacks start at a disadvantage. Historically, they were not given the same advantages that whites had. You can't run a race with whites starting halfway around the track and expect blacks to compete equally. So what we need is a redistribution of opportunity to give blacks equal opportunity. But many people think that we also need a redistribution of wealth, to simply take the wealth away from the whites and give it to the blacks. This can't work for many reasons. For example, there are just too many blacks and too few whites and too little wealth. What you get is a redistribution not of wealth, but a redistribution of poverty. Furthermore, most of the wealth that whites have is not in their bank accounts, or not in their property, or their investments, but in their heads. It's their intellectual capital that they've gained from superior education and experience, and whites will just leave South Africa and take their real wealth with them.
But there is a way in which sufficient funds can be generated to compensate blacks, at least in part, for past injustices, and that is through privatization, through the process of selling off state assets to the private sector, which is currently taking place in almost every country of the world. In this way, billions of rands can be raised, and that money could be used either in a once-off payment for all black people, or to provide them with vouchers which they could use for education, for medical assistance, or to enter the economy by buying land or starting in a business. This is the only way in which blacks can be given a start along the path to true economic involvement without destroying the economy in the process.
Interestingly, some people say that we provide too much for group rights, splitting up the country, and others say that we don't provide enough protection for groups.
Firstly, we should remember that groups are just individuals, and since we provide for a maximum protection of individual rights, groups are automatically protected. Secondly, we've provided for a minority victimization clause. That is to say, we suggest that the court should at any time be able to come to the defense of minorities or groups if they are being victimized by government at any level. And finally, we propose that anyone should be able to promote their cultural or group rights provided they do so voluntarily. They may not impose upon other groups, and they may not make discriminatory laws against other groups.
South Africans sometimes tend to confuse the devolution of power with dividing the country up. The reason for this is because we have such a centralized system of government that we forget that throughout the world, both in the West and in Eastern Bloc countries, many powers and functions are devolved to second, third, and even fourth-tier governments. We also forget that only 100 years ago, we ourselves in South Africa were divided into numerous republics, territories, and colonies, whereas Switzerland was divided 600 years ago. Most governments around the world now are considering to what extent they should centralize and devolve power. And devolution is becoming more and more popular. In Africa itself, in Ghana, they've recently proposed a new constitution which is very, very similar to the one that we outline. It's one which they call grassroots democracy, or people's power. The question is not one of dividing South Africa. We want a united country, but we want one in which power is structured in such a way that all people have the maximum say in the decisions which affect them. A country in which we have genuine democracy.
The ideas they have set out in their book are, for Francis Kendall and Louw, a logical and down-to-earth response to the fears and frustrations evident everywhere in South Africa today. On them, a better future might well be built. A future that promises justice and opportunity for all.